The wind off the Caribbean felt unusually cool that evening, as if even the tropical heat had grown wary of the chaos that Anne Bonny carried in her wake. For years her name had echoed along the shipping routes between the Bahamas and Cuba, whispered with a mixture of admiration and contempt. Unlike the male pirates whose exploits were sung in taverns or cursed by merchants, Anne's story always came with a twist. A woman disguised in men's clothes, brandishing pistols and sailing under the black flag alongside Calico Jack Rackham. But the evening of October 1720 marked the beginning of her undoing, when the Royal Navy finally caught up. The pirate sloop Revenge had seen better days. Its crew, once boisterous with rum and bold defiance, was drunk and distracted. While anchored off the coast of Jamaica, Anne Bonny, Mary Read, and a small group of men were the only ones sober enough to recognise the danger fast approaching. A well-armed British privateer schooner had crept into the inlet under the cover of night. The attack was swift, and what resistance there was came largely from Anne and Mary, who reportedly held the deck while the men hid below like cowards, refusing to fight. By dawn, the black flag was lowered, and Anne Bonny was shackled aboard a British ship bound for Spanish Town. In those days, piracy trials were often swift and brutal affairs. The British government, eager to make examples, did not hesitate to execute captured pirates, especially those who had defied royal pardons. But female pirates presented a peculiar problem. Anne Bonny's very existence violated the sensibilities of her time. Women, after all, were not meant to take up arms, much less storm ships and curse like sailors. Her arrest was more than a legal matter. It was a social embarrassment, a disruption of the natural order. The courtroom in Spanish Town was no grand hall. It was dusty, W.A.R.M., and packed with people drawn more by curiosity than justice. Anne was tried alongside Mary Read, both still clad in men's coats and breeches, their long hair tucked away under wide-brimmed hats. The judge, Nicholas Laws, Governor of Jamaica, did not hide his disbelief. The charges, piracy on the high seas, theft and resisting arrest, were standard. But the presence of two women among the accused made the proceedings feel like theatre. Witness after witness came forward, many of them reluctant sailors from captured ships. They recalled Anne as fierce, temperamental and strangely composed. One merchant swore she had threatened to shoot him herself when the rest of the pirate crew hesitated. Another described her as the most aggressive member of the Revenge's boarding party. Her voice was sharp, her pistol accurate. These stories, mundane in the context of male pirates, drew gasps from the gallery when applied to a woman. In court records, she was referred to as Anne Bonny, spinster, though she was neither single nor tame. Born around 1700 in Ireland, she was the illegitimate daughter of a lawyer and his servant, raised in South Carolina under scandalous circumstances. Her early life was filled with stories of defiance, burning her father's plantation fields, marrying a poor sailor against his wishes, and eventually fleeing to the Caribbean where she met the pirate Calico Jack. None of these facts helped her case. By the second day of the trial, the question was not guilt. She admitted to piracy, but punishment. Like so many before her, Anne faced the death sentence. Hanging was the fate of pirates, and women were not spared the noose. But Anne, like Mary Read, played her final card. "I plead my belly," she told the court. This old legal trick was both common and controversial. It allowed women to delay execution if they were found to be pregnant. Under English law, it was considered inhumane to execute a woman carrying a child. A jury of matrons, usually local women of respectable standing, was called to examine her. Their verdict: Anne was indeed pregnant. The court could not deny it. Her hanging was postponed. She was returned to prison, where she remained under heavy guard, awaiting a fate that now seemed uncertain. Calico Jack, her lover and captain, was not so lucky. He was hanged within a month, his body displayed in an iron cage at Port Royal as a warning to others. Anne was allowed one final meeting with him before his execution. The exchange, though brief, would become part of pirate folklore. When Jack asked if she had any final words for him, she reportedly replied, "If you had fought like a man, you wouldn't be hanging like a dog." It was a cutting farewell, delivered without emotion. But was it truly spoken, or just one of the many embellishments added to Anne's legend? The records don't confirm it, but the quote has endured, perhaps because it captures something essential about Anne Bonny, a woman who defied expectations to the bitter end. Back in prison, Anne's condition became a matter of speculation. Was she truly pregnant, or had she only delayed the inevitable? Her name faded from the trial logs not long after, lost in the swirl of colonial paperwork and British disinterest. No execution record exists for her, no grave bears her name, only silence. So what really happened to Anne Bonny after her trial? Was she released? Did she escape? Was her father wealthy enough to buy her freedom and bury the scandal quietly? The trail, at least in official records, goes cold. But is absence of evidence the same as evidence of absence? Why would someone so infamous simply disappear without a trace? When a pirate was sentenced to death in the early 18th century, the expectation was finality. Ropes were knotted, gallows assembled, and sentences carried out with methodical speed. But Anne Bonny's story refused to end where it should have. After her dramatic trial in Spanish Town, the record-keeping, once so precise and dutiful, suddenly grew vague. No date of execution, no burial, no follow-up. It's as though the moment the court acknowledged her pregnancy, Anne Bonny quietly slipped out of history's grip. What we know for certain is that she remained imprisoned at least for a short time after the trial in late 1720. Spanish Town's jail was overcrowded and unsanitary, especially for women. If Anne truly carried a child, her survival would have depended on a rare alignment of luck, health and privilege. And privilege, in this case, may have played a subtle role. Her father, William Cormack, had once been a respected lawyer and plantation owner in Charlestown, now Charleston, South Carolina. Despite disowning Anne when she eloped with a penniless sailor, many believe he later used his influence and wealth to protect her from the gallows. Support for this theory comes not from direct documentation, but from a curious gap in the historical record. The Jamaican court records, so meticulous in detailing piracy trials, do not mention Anne Bonny again after December 1720. No date of execution, no record of continued imprisonment. A single line written in a prison ledger, likely added by a clerk years later, claims that Anne was discharged. But discharged to where, and by whose authority? Some researchers point to a possible secret transfer. In rare instances, prisoners were quietly handed off to powerful patrons or family members who could ensure their silence. Given the embarrassment Anne's notoriety brought to both the British Empire and to her own family, it's plausible that all parties involved wanted her quietly removed from public life. If her father intervened, perhaps through a payment or legal favour, Anne may have returned to the American colonies under a false identity. Several local legends from the Carolinas support this idea, though none offer definitive proof. A woman Matty Hing Anne's description reportedly settled near Charleston under the name Anne Fulford, marrying a local planter and raising a family. She lived well into her 70s, according to one family Bible, and never spoke of her past. The Fulford family story, passed down for generations, claimed that their great-grandmother had once sailed with pirates and escaped the hangman's noose. But whether this was true or just an attempt to lend drama to dull genealogy remains uncertain. There's also the lingering mystery of the child. If Anne gave birth in prison, what happened to the baby? No record survives of its name, gender, or fate. It's entirely possible that the child did not survive infancy. Infant mortality was high in the 18th century, especially in unsanitary prison conditions, but it's equally possible the child was handed over to family, hidden or adopted under another name, another loose thread in an already tangled historical fabric. Some historians propose a darker possibility, that Anne died in childbirth or shortly after and was buried in an unmarked grave, too much of an embarrassment for public record. But if that were the case, why wouldn't court documents reflect it? Deaths of condemned pirates were almost always logged and published. Anne's sudden disappearance from all official documentation hints not at death, but at deliberate omission. Then there's the theory that she returned to piracy. Romantic as it may sound, this is the least likely scenario. By 1721, the British Navy had cracked down hard on Caribbean piracy. Calico Jack was dead, and Anne's remaining allies had either been executed or scattered. The golden age of piracy was drawing to a close. A woman as infamous as Anne Bonny would have had a target on her back, and few crews would risk harbouring her, and she knew it. Her courage may have been wild, but her instincts were sharp. Anne likely understood that her only chance at survival was silence, not resistance. Still, that hasn't stopped the speculation. Anne Bonny has become a kind of historical ghost, constantly evoked, never confirmed. Her story appears in pirate lore, romantic novels, and even television dramas. Often she is shown wielding a cutlass, facing down enemies, or vanishing into the horizon with her unborn child cradled against her chest. But none of this reflects the duller, more realistic truth that she probably lived a long, quiet life, intentionally erased by those who once feared her. There's one final detail that may lend weight to the theory of her survival. In a will dated 1782, a man named Josiah Burley from South Carolina left a portion of his estate to Anne Bonny, identified as his wife. The spelling is not exact, and no corroborating birth records confirm her identity. But the timeline would match. A woman born around 1700 would have been in her early 80s by 1782. The fact that someone bearing that name lived long enough to appear in a legal will suggests, at the very least, that Anne Bonny's legend may have found a quiet landing place after all. And if she did live, if she walked away from the gallows and became just another name in the Carolina Hills, what did she think about her old life? Did she ever tell her grandchildren that she once held a pistol to a captain's chest, or stood trial for piracy in a tropical courtroom full of men who couldn't believe what they were seeing? Or did she remain silent, letting the stories fade away like cannon smoke over the open sea? If Anne Bonny did indeed slip into obscurity after her trial, she did so with the kind of precision that only history's most elusive figures manage. No portraits, no tombstone, no public statements, just rumours, family names, and passing references that lead nowhere in particular. She left behind no diary, no letters, no final confession. And perhaps that was intentional. Silence, after all, can be more effective than 1,000 retellings. Idal Yisol. Lows the myth to grow, unburdened by the dull weight of truth. By the late 1720s, piracy in the Caribbean was no longer what it had been. The British Navy's relentless campaign had closed the curtain on the so-called Golden Age. Former pirate havens, like Nassau, New Providence and Port Royal, were now heavily garrisoned or altogether abandoned. The world Anne had once ruled with pistol and sabre had been smoothed over by the dull tools of empire. Trade regulations, naval patrols, tax codes and colonial governors. The last thing the British wanted was to immortalise a woman who had openly mocked their authority on the open sea. This explains, in part, why so little was written about her at the time. Anne Bonny became a taboo figure in official accounts. Where Blackbeard or Bartholomew Roberts could be used as cautionary tales, Anne was something else entirely, an exception that made people uncomfortable. A woman in trousers who fought like a man but was treated differently by law. Her case forced courts to bring in midwives, delay sentences and consider outcomes the system wasn't built to accommodate. She didn't just break laws, she broke categories. Her silence after the trial served the interests of many. For the colonial government, it erased a difficult legal precedent. For her family, assuming her father or any relatives did intervene, it restored some measure of dignity. And for Anne herself, silence may have been a kind of survival. What use was infamy when every port was on alert and every sailor had heard your name? If she had the chance to start over, anonymity was her only safe harbour. But Anne's disappearance didn't stop her from becoming folklore. By the early 19th century, her story had entered popular imagination through books like A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates, published in 1724 under the pseudonym Captain Charles Johnson. The book, part fact and part fiction, was the source of much of what we believe we know about her. The final quote to Calais, Kojak, the fierce resistance on deck, and the dramatic plea of pregnancy. It was through these pages that Anne Bonny was transformed from historical curiosity into pirate icon. Even today, museums and tours devoted to pirate history will invoke her name. There are plaques in Nassau, murals in Key West, and historical reenactments in Charleston. None of them, however, can point to a grave or even a confirmed artifact. Her pistols, if they survived, were likely melted down or lost at sea. Her clothing, if preserved, would have been indistinguishable from any sailor's gear of the time. In material terms, she left almost nothing behind. Yet her legacy is strangely persistent. In feminist readings of history, Anne is often reclaimed as a rebel against gender norms. She challenged not only the roles prescribed to her, but also the legal system that tried to contain her. She didn't seek permission to fight, nor did she offer apologies for her violence. While some modern scholars caution against romanticizing her too much, after all, she was a pirate, not a revolutionary. There's no denying the symbolic weight she carries. In truth, Anne Bonny was never a freedom fighter in the modern sense. She wasn't trying to change the world, just her place in it. But the fact that she did so, and lived long enough to outlast her sentence, makes her story remarkable nonetheless. In an age where women were denied most forms of agency, she took to the sea with loaded pistols and lived on her own terms, for a time, and then she disappeared. That disappearance, rather than a failure of record-keeping, might have been her most lasting rebellion. To vanish from the historical record, to slip past the noose, the narrative and the empire's need for closure, was itself a kind of victory. Most pirates died screaming under a gallows, but Anne Bonny faded into a quiet life that no one could fully confire. Or deny. In doing so, she became something larger than her crimes, larger than her sentence, something timeless. If you look hard enough, you'll find traces, a surname that doesn't quite fit. A line in a will. A whispered story passed from one low-country grandmother to another. These are the echoes she left behind, quiet, stubborn and unresolved. So perhaps the better question isn't what happened to Anne Bonny, but why we still care. Why do we return to her story again and again, searching the past for a woman who refused to fit her time? Long before Mary Read ever set foot on the deck of a pirate ship, she lived a life wrapped in secrecy, carefully constructed lies, quiet survival, and the ever-present need to be someone else. Born in England sometime around 1685, Mary's first disguise wasn't about piracy at all, it was about poverty. Her mother, a widow or possibly abandoned by her seafaring husband, was left alone with a single son. When that boy died young, Mary became his replacement, not symbolically, but literally. Needing financial support from her late husband's mother-in-law, who had been sending money for the boy's upkeep, Mary's mother dressed her daughter as a son and continued the charade. The grandmother, unaware of the switch, continued her modest payments, and so Mary grew up not as Mary, but as a boy, wearing breeches and answering to a name that wasn't hers. This wasn't an act of rebellion, it was survival. In the rigid economy of 17th century England, widowhood and orphanhood often spelled starvation. A lie was more manageable than hunger. Years passed and Mary remained in disguise. Unlike most girls her age, she learned the rhythms of male labour. She worked in stables, served as a footboy, and later joined the crew of a ship, always as a young man. These weren't glamorous jobs, and there was little room for daydreams, but what they offered, more than anything else, was freedom. As a man, Mary moved through the world with fewer questions asked. The disguise wasn't just for her grandmother's sake anymore. It had become a way of living. At some point in her teens or early 20s, Mary enlisted in the British military. The exact branch remains unclear. Some sources suggest she served in the infantry, others hint at cavalry, but the accounts agree on one thing: she was a competent, even respected soldier. She fought in Flanders, possibly during the War of the Spanish Succession, and it was there, in the mud and confusion of camp life, that she reportedly fell in love with a fellow soldier. According to early biographies, she revealed her secret to him. They married, and together opened an inn near Breda in the Netherlands. But the peace did not last. Her husband died, either in battle or from illness, and Mary, once again adrift, resumed her male identity and returned to sea. The oceans were not safe during this period. Pirates prowled the shipping lanes from the Caribbean to the West African coast. Mary's next ship was captured by pirates, and she, like many forced crewmen, had a choice: join or perish. She joined. The pirate crew she joined operated under the Jolly Roger, living by an odd and brutal code of democracy, where captains were elected and plunder divided by vote. It was a world where violence was common but hierarchy was slippery, for Mary, who had already learned how to mask her identity and survive in male spaces. It may have been the most natural next step in her life. Eventually, her path crossed with Anne Bonny, another woman in disguise, and together they became two of the most feared pirates sailing under Calico Jack Rackham. Most accounts agree that Mary revealed her identity to Anne first. Some even suggest that Anne initially flirted with Mary, not realising she was a woman. When Mary confessed, Anne swore to keep her secret. Calico Jack, the captain and Anne's lover, eventually learned the truth as well. Oddly, he did not dismiss Mary. In fact, he seemed to respect her, perhaps for her combat skills, or perhaps for the strange bond she shared with Anne. Mary was not content to stay below decks. She fought fiercely in raids, duels, and ship-to-ship combat. Witnesses claimed she dressed as a man in battle, but did not hide her gender among those who knew her. She carried pistols, used a cutlass, and reportedly killed more than one opponent. Unlike many pirates who preferred intimidation over violence, Mary seemed to engage directly, often fighting more boldly than the men beside her. But piracy, as always, brought consequences. In October 1720, the crew was surprised and captured by a British sloop off the coast of Jamaica. They had been drinking, celebrating a recent plunder. Most of the men were too drunk to fight. Only Anne and Mary resisted, reportedly screaming at their crewmates to come up and fight like men. When no one responded, the women fired their pistols alone, buying time before they were overwhelmed. It was a bitter end to an otherwise bold career. They were taken to Spanish Town for trial, along with Calico Jack and the rest of the crew. As expected, the men were swiftly condemned and sentenced to hang. But Anne and Mary, once again, had a plan. When asked for final words, both women pleaded their bellies. They were pregnant, they claimed. According to English common law, a pregnant woman could not be hanged until after she gave birth, and so the noose was delayed. For the court, this posed a logistical problem. They could not execute women carrying children, nor could they release them. Both were imprisoned under watch. Anne's fate would soon become a mystery as her name vanished from records. But Mary's story continued, for a short while. Reports suggest that Mary did not survive long in prison. Whether from disease, complications of pregnancy, or untreated injuries, she died in her cell less than a year after capture. Her burial was noted in Jamaican records. Mary Read Pirate buried 1721. No grave marker survives, and the exact location of her remains is unknown. What's remarkable is not just the life she lived, but the path that led her there. Long before she raised a cutlass, Mary Read was navigating a world that refused to see her as she truly was. She survived war, loss, and poverty, not through force, but through adaptability. Her life was shaped not by open rebellion, but by the quiet decision to pass unnoticed, to become who the world would allow her to be, while still keeping a piece of herself hidden. And yet, was her final disguise, her life as a pirate, the first time she lived truly free? By the time Mary Read found herself in a prison cell in Spanish Town, Jamaica, the romantic illusions of piracy had long since evaporated. There was no salt wind in her hair, no clinking gold, and no cheering crew. The stink of confinement was thick in the humid air. Rats scurried beneath wooden planks, and the stone walls wept moisture in long, quiet drips. In these bleak surroundings, Mary wasn't feared. She wasn't praised. She was simply detained, like so many others who had dared to live outside the lines drawn by kings and merchants. What makes Mary's time in prison particularly fascinating isn't the conditions, gruesome as they likely were, but the strange limbo she occupied. She was both condemned and protected. Her claim of pregnancy had saved her from the noose, at least temporarily, but it had not spared her from the slow erosion of jail. Unlike many of her male counterparts who were hanged swiftly, Mary was subjected to time. Colonial records confirm that she was held under watch while authorities awaited confirmation of her pregnancy. This wasn't taken at her word. Midwives or physicians were usually brought in to examine the woman. The process was clinical, even invasive. Once verified, the execution was postponed, but not cancelled. The law merely waited until the child was born. Then the sentence could resume. There's some uncertainty about whether I was actually pregnant. Some records say yes, others remain vague. It's possible the claim was a lie, a tactic to delay death. Or perhaps she had indeed conceived, whether by a lover aboard the ship or in the course of her imprisonment. The truth, like so much about her life, remains uncertain. What we do know is that she did not live to face execution. In April 1721, the records show her burial. The cause of death is not listed, but contemporary sources point to either fever or complications from childbirth. Conditions in the Spanish Town jail were notoriously unsanitary, and it is likely Mary succumbed to something preventable, had she been a man of higher rank or a woman of gentler station. But Mary was neither. She was a pirate, a criminal, and a puzzle to the legal system. One of the most overlooked aspects of Mary Read's end is how quietly it happened. There was no dramatic final speech, no crowd, no last defiant gesture from the gallows. She faded out of history not with gunfire, but with a line in a burial register. A pirate reduced to an entry in a colonial church book. Mary Read, buried April 1721. It's an anticlimax that almost feels deliberate, as though the world wanted to forget what she had represented. And yet her memory didn't vanish. In fact, her legend had already begun to form. Her trial, alongside Anne Bonny, was one of the most widely reported pirate prosecutions of the 18th century. Newspapers as far as London printed details of the proceedings. The image of two women, fierce and unrepentant, standing among a drunken crew of men captured the imagination of the public. People wanted to know, how had women managed to succeed in such a brutal and masculine world? But Mary's success hadn't come from brute strength alone. It came from adaptation, from endurance, and from the long years of learning to pass. In many ways, her life had been one long performance, shaped by necessity. She had been a boy, a soldier, a widow, a sailor, and a pirate. At every stage, she adopted a role, not always to deceive, but often to survive. And it was this ability to move between identities that made her so dangerous to the society that judged her. The law, after all, was built on categories: man and woman, soldier and criminal, free and enslaved. Mary refused to fit neatly into any of them. In prison, she wasn't just a woman. She was a woman who had lived as a man, a pirate who had fought like a man, but appealed to mercy as a woman. Even the judges at her trial seemed confused. They could condemn her actions, but not her existence. Her plea of pregnancy was an admission of identity, but also a final act of manipulation. She knew what the law would do with a pregnant woman. She used its rules against it. There's also something to be said about the bond between Mary and Anne Bonny during their imprisonment. Though the records grow quieter after the trial, it is likely they shared a cell, or at least kept contact. They had fought side by side, and now faced execution together. Anne's fate, as previously noted, remains a mystery, but Mary's death brought their partnership to a close. Whatever understanding they shared, be it friendship, alliance, or something more complex, ended not in violence, but in slow, quiet decline. There is no surviving letter from Mary, no account of her final days. But if she did have time to reflect, it's hard not to wonder what she made of her life. Did she regret the deceptions that had sustained her? Did she wish she'd lived openly, or did she find peace in her layered identities? She had defied convention, defied law, and defied death, at least for a time. And now, in the dim cell of Spanish Town, she had become something else, a symbol. And yet her story still leaves us with questions. If Mary had survived her sentence, if she had been released, what kind of life could she have led? Would she have returned to disguises, to labour, to war? Or was piracy, for all its violence, the only time she was truly herself? After Mary Read's quiet death in a Jamaican prison cell in 1721, the world was left with a question it didn't quite know how to answer. What precisely had she been? A pirate? Certainly. A criminal? By law, yes. But Mary's life had been more than a list of charges and disguises. She had lived between definitions, between gender, between duty and rebellion, between survival and self. Her story did not end with a fiery rebellion or dramatic execution. It ended with a burial in foreign soil, a woman with no marked grave, no mourning family, and no legacy carved in stone. But that did not mean she was forgotten. Within a decade of her death, Mary's name had begun to reappear in pamphlets and popular histories. Most notably, she was featured in a general history of the robberies and murders of the most notorious pirates, a wildly influential book first published in 1724 and attributed to Captain Charles Johnson, a pseudonym possibly even used by Daniel Defoe. This book helped shape the mythology of piracy, mixing fact, rumour and outright invention into a single narrative. In its pages, Mary and Anne Bonny were described in vivid, swashbuckling terms, brave, bold and ruthless, shocking the sensibilities of their time. It is here that much of the Mary Read legend was formed. The real details of her life were few and scattered, but the gaps were quickly filled in by those who found her fascinating. She became a kind of folk hero, not unlike a pirate Joan of Arc, someone who lived outside the rules, not for glory, but because no other place would accept her. In an era when women had so little control over their own lives, Mary Read represented an anomaly, a woman who chose her fate again and again, even when the world punished her for it. Still, these later retellings often romanticized Mary's story, smoothing out the rougher edges and framing her as an adventurous rebel rather than a desperate survivor. But the truth, as usual, was far more complicated. Mary's choices, masquerading as a boy, enlisting in war, marrying in secret, returning to sea, joining pirates, were never made from luxury or comfort. They were forged in hardship. She was not born into privilege, and every stage of her life was a negotiation with power, hunger, and violence. When you consider how the world treated female pirates after they were caught, Mary's case is one of the rare exceptions where the person is remembered at all. Many others simply disappeared into legal archives. Some were executed without delay. Others were imprisoned indefinitely or quietly sold into forced labour. If they survived, they usually vanished into ordinary life, their stories buried under new names and anonymous fates. There was, after all, no real place in 18th century society for women who had wielded swords, stolen ships, and stood defiant in court. Respectable society didn't want them as wives. The state didn't want them as citizens. They were dangerous not only because they had committed crimes, but because they had lived visibly in ways women were not supposed to. Their punishment wasn't just meant to eliminate a threat, it was meant to erase a possibility. And yet Mary's story endured. She reappeared in penny novels of the 19th century, in Victorian moral tales that tried to turn her into a cautionary figure. Later still, 20th century feminists and queer historians reclaimed her as a symbol of resistance, an early example of gender nonconformity and bodily autonomy. Scholars debated whether she identified as a woman who simply wore men's clothes for safety, or whether she might have embraced a more fluid identity that defied the binary altogether. There are no clear answers, but perhaps that ambiguity is the point. Mary's life reminds us that identity, especially in times of great hards, hip, is rarely fixed. It shifts, it bends, it survives. She passed as a boy to support her mother, fought as a man to earn a living, and loved as a woman when she could. She did not pick one role and stick with it. She moved between them, not to deceive, but to live. And so, in her death, Mary became what she could not fully be in life. Remembered. She left no children, no heirs, no treasures buried on distant islands, but she left something more durable, the shape of a story that refuses to conform, a story that still stirs questions long after the grave has been forgotten. Was Mary Read a heroine, a criminal, a legend, or was she simply what the world forced her to become? And if she were alive today, what name would she have chosen for herself? When Anne Bonny stood before the court in Jamaica in 1720, she was not wearing a pirate's coat or wielding a cutlass. She wore, likely, a simple dress, not chosen but issued, and the heavy air of the courtroom pressed around her like a noose. Behind her were months at sea, a storm of violence and survival. Ahead of her was a legal process designed not just to punish pirates, but to erase them from respectable memory. She had been captured, tried and sentenced to hang. But unlike many others, Anne Bonny did not vanish from history quietly. Her trial became a doorway to legend. Anne Bonny was not raised to be invisible. Born around 1700, probably in County Cork, Ireland, she was the illegitimate daughter of a lawyer and his maid. Her father's decision to raise her as his own, disguised for a time as a boy, was both scandalous and unusual. It introduced her early to a life of blurred roles and hidden truths. When the family moved to the Carolinas to escape gossip, Anne was a young girl who knew how to listen without being seen. That skill would serve her well later, when she learned to survive among men who measured power by who shouted the loudest or killed the fastest. But before she became a pirate, Anne became a wife, or more accurately, a rebel. At 16, she married a sailor named James. Bonny against her father's wishes. In response, her father disowned her. Anne left Charleston behind and followed her husband to the Bahamas. It was there, on the island of New Providence, the so-called Republic of Pirates, that Anne found the life she would never return from. New Providence in the early 1700s was no ordinary colonial port. It was a haven for pirates, smugglers, and ship deserters. Men who had deserted the Royal Navy drank alongside former privateers. Fortunes were won and lost in taverns, and law, as it was recognised in London, rarely reached those shores. It was in this strange pocket of freedom that Anne encountered Calico Jack Rackham, a charming and reckless pirate captain who would soon become both her partner and her undoing. Anne left her husband to join Rackham, an act that scandalised even the libertine society of New Providence. But she did not join him as a stowaway, or a lover hiding below deck. She sailed openly, armed, ready and furious. And with her was another woman disguised as a man, Mary Read. Together the two would become symbols of something colonial courts could not name, let alone categorise. By the time Anne and Mary were captured in 1720, their ship had already been surrounded by a privateering vessel sent to eliminate pirate threats in the Caribbean. Rackham and most of the male crew were reportedly drunk below deck. Anne and Mary, according to witness accounts, were the only ones who fought back with weapons. But it didn't matter. They were overpowered and dragged back to Jamaica, where the legal machinery began to grind forward. The courtroom in Spanish Town, Jamaica, was a space of order. At least that was its intent. But when Anne Bonny was brought to stand trial, the courtroom also became a kind of stage. The presence of a female pirate defied not only law, but imagination. The governor, Sir Nicholas Laws, had little patience for pirates. He had already executed dozens. But Anne was different. Her gender did not soften her charges. If anything, it sharpened the blade. The court charged Anne and Mary with piracies, felonies and robberies upon the high seas. There was no question of guilt. The evidence was clear, the witnesses plentiful. But Anne's presence seemed to stir something deeper than legal concern. She had sailed dressed as a man, fought beside outlaws and cursed authority without shame. She had not pleaded innocence. She had not begged for mercy. And when the death sentence was handed down, she didn't collapse. She did something else. She declared she was pregnant. This single fact interrupted the march toward execution. Under English law, a pregnant woman could not be hanged. The court was required to verify the claim. A group of midwives or appointed examiners would have been brought in. Once confirmed, the sentence was postponed. But not everyone in that courtroom was satisfied with delay. Anne's presence had already become an embarrassment, not because of what she had done, but because of what she represented. A woman who had lived freely, taken up arms, and loved without permission was a threat not just to order, but to imagination. She was, in effect, too dangerous to remember and too loud to erase. And so, like Mary Read, she was confined. But unlike Mary, Anne did not die in prison. What happened next remains one of the strangest puzzles in pirate history. There is no record of Anne Bonny's execution, no public hanging, no final speech, no death register. One would expect the colony to record the end of such a notorious figure. But after her initial sentence, she simply disappears from the official documents, and that silence has given rise to 1,000 theories. Some say her father, who had disowned her, used his influence and money to arrange her release. Others claim she returned to Charleston, lived under a new name, and died decades later as a respectable woman. Some even suggest she returned to Pera, though there is no evidence of it. What is clear is that the court's intention to punish her was never fulfilled. And so, the trial of Anne Bonny never really ended. The legal case was closed, but her legend escaped the courtroom. But what if the records were incomplete on purpose? What if the silence around Anne's fate was more than accident? What if the world simply didn't know what to do with a woman who refused to be quiet? Anne Bonny's final moments in the historical record feel more like an ellipsis than a full stop. One day she was in a Jamaican prison, sentenced to death and awaiting the birth of a child. The next, she vanished. Not into legend, but into silence. For most criminals of the era, especially pirates, the law left little ambiguity. Sentences were carried out, bodies were accounted for, and deaths were recorded with cold, bureaucratic precision. But not with Anne. Her name simply stopped appearing. The most commonly accepted explanation is that her father intervened. William Cormack, a wealthy planter and lawyer, had long been established in Charleston, South Carolina. Despite having disowned Anne years earlier for her scandalous marriage and disgraceful behaviour, it's possible he still retained some private affection, or perhaps he simply wanted to avoid further disgrace to the family name. Either way, some sources claim that he used his influence to secure Anne's release and quietly brought her back to the colonies, under strict conditions of anonymity. If this version is to be believed, Anne Bonny lived out her days as someone else. She remarried, perhaps to a man named Joseph Burley or Joseph Holmes. She had several children. She lived into her 80s. Some parish records in South Carolina note the burial of a woman named Anne Clark in 1782, who matches many details of Bonny's supposed later life. If this was her, it would mean Anne spent over 60 years carrying a past no one around her was allowed to mention. And yet, there is no firm proof. The lack of records could be seen as deliberate. After all, colonial authorities in Jamaica had no reason to trumpet their failure to execute such a notorious prisoner. A woman pirate evading justice would have made the court look weak and the law look inconsistent. Silencing the story was easier than defending the decision. Likewise, for her father or any family member back in the colonies, letting Anne slip into obscurity under a new name may have been the only way to preserve some fragile version of respectability. But to understand the mystery of Anne's disappearance, we must return to what her sentence actually meant at the time. To be a pirate in the early 18th century was more than breaking maritime law. It was political. Pirates threatened trade, empire, and property. They challenged hierarchies, and sometimes, even if unintentionally, modelled alternate forms of society. Crews that divided treasure equally, that elected their captains, or that allowed women to fight beside men, were dangerous symbols in a world obsessed with order and class. The British government, particularly after the War of the Spanish Succession, had grown tired of tolerating piracy. It issued pardons, bounties, and finally full military suppression. Anne Bonny, by all accounts, was not just a footnote in this campaign. She had become a symbol of its failure. Her existence in court, sharp-tongued, pregnant, and defiantly unapologetic, put a face to everything colonial patriarchy feared: female disobedience, sexual autonomy, and physical resistance to authority. Killing her would have made her a martyr. Releasing her would have looked weak. Disappearing her, that perhaps seemed the safest course. It is worth considering how her gender shaped this outcome. Male pirates captured in the same trials, such as Calico Jack Rackham, were hanged quickly and publicly, their bodies displayed as a warning. There was no pregnancy to delay the sentence, no social panic about what their deaths might symbolise. Anne and Mary, on the other hand, brought a different kind of danger. Their crimes were not just theft and mutiny. Their very existence challenged assumptions about what women could or should do. The colonial world was ill-equipped to make sense of women like them, and so instead of reckoning with their stories, the courts turned away. The archives fell silent. But not the imagination. Over time, Anne Bonny became more legend than fact. She appeared in ballads, tavern songs, and eventually novels. Some depicted her as a ruthless killer, others as a misunderstood lover. Victorian writers cleaned up her image to suit more conservative tastes, turning her into a tragic heroine who regretted her sins. 20th century feminists tried to claim her as a rebel ahead of her time, but through it all, the core of her story remained elusive. What we do know is that Anne was unusually outspoken during her trial. Witnesses reported that she mocked Calico Jack after his execution, allegedly saying, "If he had fought like a man, he need not have been hanged like a dog." The court had expected her to beg, to weep, to explain. Instead, she answered with a sword's edge of wit. It was not repentance they heard, but resistance. This may help explain why her punishment was never completed. Her execution was delayed, but her voice could not be stilled in chains. In her final known words, she showed no interest in redemption, and that was more frightening to colonial authorities than any mutiny at sea. We may never know what Anne Bonny did after she left that prison. if indeed she left it at all. Theories abound. Some say she returned to piracy under a new name, others that she fled inland and lived in peace. Some imagine her raising children with the quiet intensity of someone who once faced death and refused to blink. Others picture her wandering the docks of Charleston, watching ships leave port, longing for salt and wind. What's most striking, though, is how completely the records fall away after her trial. No newspaper notices, no legal updates, no accounts of execution. A woman once declared an enemy of the empire disappeared as though she had never existed. But maybe the real question isn't where she went. It's why they wanted us to forget her in the first place. Anne Bonny's footsteps disappeared from official records, but her presence never quite left the world that tried to erase her. Long after the courtroom emptied and the cell doors closed, people kept asking what really happened to her. It's the kind of question that doesn't go away, not because of what Anne Bonny did, but because of what she represented. A woman who not only sailed with pirates, but who refused to apologise for it. That, more than theft or rebellion, was what colonial order couldn't tolerate. She never fit neatly into the categories the 18th century offered women, so the system found a different way to handle her. It removed her from the page, but not from the story. Historians today still debate her fate. A few 18th century letters and journals hinted that she had lived quietly into old age under the name Anne Clark, or perhaps Anne Fulford. In one South Carolina parish register, a woman of that name is listed as dying in 1782, in her 80s if it was really Anne Bonny. If true, it would mean she lived far longer than most pirates, and that she had the rare opportunity to witness the world change around her. Revolutions, empires, new ships, and the slow unravelling of the very system that once sentenced her to death. But the records that suggest her survival are themselves dull, incomplete, and easy to overlook. And maybe that's the point. If Anne Bonny did survive, it wasn't in a blaze of glory. It was in laundry, childbirth, long days spent folding linens and boiling water for soup. It was in sitting quietly beside a husband who may never have known what she once was. This is the Peking part of history we rarely talk about. The afterlives of scandal. What becomes of rebels when the fire dies down? How do you return to normal life after living so far outside of it? There's no certainty that Anne ever lived in peace. Perhaps she died in that Jamaican cell after all, or perhaps she watched from a quiet distance as the myth of Anne Bonny grew larger than anything she could control. In time, people turned her into whatever they needed. A villain, a feminist icon, a romantic figure, a ghost. Everyone seemed to want something from her story. And yet, beneath all the retellings, the real Anne Bonny remains slightly out of reach, half in the shadows like she always was. The woman who joined Calico Jack and Mary Read, who disguised herself as a man, who charged at armed naval officers with a pistol in hand, that woman has never been fully captured, not even by historians. Too many details are missing, too many motives are unclear. What we have is a silhouette, bold, blurred, and unmistakably present. What is clear, though, is the pattern of silence surrounding her. The court stopped mentioning her. Newspapers didn't print her death. Jailers didn't keep detailed logs of her final days. It's as if the colonial system, after punishing so many pirates so visibly, chose to look away when it came to Anne. And maybe it's not because they didn't know what happened. Maybe it's because they did, and wanted no one else to. The silence becomes its own kind of sentence. It tells us something about the power Anne Bonny had. Even when shackled, she unsettled the men who tried to punish her because she didn't fit. She wasn't meek. She wasn't maternal. She didn't offer the courtroom the one thing it truly wanted from her: shame. In that sense, Anne Bonny was dangerous not because of her sword, but because of her refusal to regret it. Her story echoes in unexpected places. It says, in dusty trial transcripts, in tavern legends, in old colonial letters that refer vaguely to that infamous woman pirate. She may have lived an ordinary life after her capture, but it is her refusal to end in the way others did that made her extraordinary. Even in silence, she lingered. Her ghost haunts the history books, not with vengeance, but with defiance. And perhaps the reason her story has lasted so long, far beyond her actual crimes, is because it forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about power, about justice, about what we do to women who refuse to play the role expected of them, about how courts can deliver punishment but not always control legacy. So in the end, Anne Bonny's trial never ended because the world never stopped wondering. Was she executed and forgotten, or did she live a quiet life, unspoken and unrepentant, in the very society that once condemned her? And if so, how many other women like her disappeared, not because they were caught, but because they refused to surrender who they really were? It started, not with a ship, but with a beheading. Jeanne de Clisson was born around 1300 into a wealthy and noble family in the Duchy of Brittany, France. Her early life followed the expected path of a medieval noblewoman: marriage, children, estate management. By her second marriage, she was securely settled in the upper layers of feudal society. She was not a rebel, not a soldier, and certainly not someone anyone expected to ever see aboard a warship. But history has a quiet way of snapping when a personal injustice strikes at just the right time. And for Jeanne, that moment came in 1343 when her husband Olivier de Clisson was accused of treason by the French crown and executed in secret. There was no public trial, no formal explanation, just a sudden accusation, an arrest, and a swift decapitation in Paris. It was meant to be efficient, quiet, the kind of state justice that ends a story before it begins. But instead, it started one. Jeanne, now a widow with 5 children, understood the message. The king, Philip VI, and the royal advisers in Paris considered her family expendable. Olivier's execution had more to do with politics than guilt. Tensions in Brittany were boiling over, part of a larger feud between France and England. Olivier had been loyal to the French crown for years, but that didn't matter. He was a useful example, and Jeanne, left behind, was meant to fade from the scene, a quiet, noble widow, disgraced and contained. She did not. What Jeanne did next was not immediate. It took months, maybe years, but the facts that followed are among the most astonishing transformations in medieval European history. The noblewoman who had once managed households and arranged marriages began selling off family lands. She abandoned court life. She fled to English territory with her 2 sons, where she made an unlikely alliance with the English king, a man her husband had once fought. From there, her campaign of revenge began. Jeanne de Clisson took up piracy. She sold what remained of her fortune and bought 3 ships, warships, painted entirely black. Their sails were dyed deep crimson. According to later accounts, she named her flagship La Mer Noire, the Black Fleet. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a floating declaration of vengeance. Jeanne and her crew, made up of exiles, mercenaries and loyal Breton soldiers, patrolled the English Channel, targeting French ships. But not just any French ships. She went after supply vessels, troop carriers and noblemen. When captured, ordinary sailors were sometimes released, but noble officials, especially those tied to the French court, were executed on the spot. It was said she carried out the executions herself. What turned Jeanne de Clisson into a feared figure along the French coast wasn't just the brutality, it was the precision. She didn't pillage randomly or hoard treasure like other pirates. She attacked with purpose. Her piracy wasn't about profit, it was punishment. For roughly 13 years, Jeanne terrorized French naval lines, making her name feared from Normandy to the Bay of Biscay. She operated not like a rogue, but like a privateer, albeit one who had appointed herself. England, conveniently at war with France in the 100 Years' War, looked the other way. Some English commanders even quietly supported her efforts, seeing her as a useful tool to weaken France from within. Others simply saw her as a woman with nothing to lose, which in truth she was. What's particularly striking about Jeanne's pirate career is how efficiently it was erased in later histories. For centuries, her story barely appeared in French chronicles. Even in English ones, she was mentioned only as a curious anomaly. A noblewoman turned criminal, yes, but hardly more than a footnote. Yet in her time she disrupted royal transport, unsettled military logistics, and humiliated the French crown, and all because the king had underestimated what one widow could do when cornered. Of course, the sea was not a safe haven forever. Jeanne's career at sea eventually came to an end, not because of capture, but because of exhaustion. Her children were growing. She had made her point. Eventually, she settled down in English-controlled Brittany, remarried for a 3rd time, and died quietly sometime around 1359. No arrest, no punishment, no apologies. In the end, the noblewoman who had once served the crown finished her life as a legend the crown preferred to forget. Yet if we step back and look at her story, not as a tale of revenge, but as a case of transformation, we begin to see something deeper. Jeanne de Clisson did not simply lash out because her husband was killed. She watched a system she had lived inside, the feudal court, royal authority, noble privilege, betray its own rules. And instead of collapsing under it, she turned that betrayal into a new purpose. One woman, one fleet, and a thirst for justice that no courtroom could ever deliver. But what kind of justice was I? And what happened to Jeanne's sons? Raised on ships between ports under a flag of vengeance? Could the legacy of piracy truly end once revenge had been claimed? The sails, dyed crimson, must have been a shocking sight on the grey waters of the English Channel. When Jeanne de Clisson's warships emerged from the mist or from behind a rocky headland, merchants and royal supply vessels alike knew they were about to face something unlike any other pirate crew at sea. Her fleet wasn't the largest or the best equipped, but it was targeted, ruthless and disciplined, and that made it dangerous. Jeanne did not sail under a recognised flag. She had no letters of marque, no royal pardon waiting at the end of her mission. She wasn't a licensed privateer. She was something more personal and far more unpredictable. Her piracy wasn't for plunder. It was punishment. Each capture had a point, and each prisoner was a symbol. If the ship bore men connected to the French nobility or court, their fates were sealed before they were even dragged aboard. The attacks often followed the same pattern. Jeanne's fleet would corner a vessel, hoist its red sails to signal no quarter, and close in. Her men, a mixture of former soldiers, Breton loyalists, and likely a few English volunteers, boarded fast and violently. If French nobles were found aboard, they were executed on deck, sometimes immediately. Others were taken briefly as prisoners, interrogated and then dispatched. Ordinary crewmen, cooks, deckhands or shipwrights were sometimes spared and released to spread word of what had happened. This was psychological warfare, as much as it was naval disruption. Jeanne wasn't just striking at supply lines. She was teaching France that its betrayal of her family would come at a steep and humiliating cost, and for more than a decade, the French crown had no clear answer to her. The English court tolerated her actions, and perhaps even encouraged them. England and France were deep into the early phases of the 100 Years' War, and any disruption to French shipping was welcomed. There is no evidence of official English funding, but Jeanne and her sons were offered shelter in English-controlled lands and ports, suggesting that some kind of understanding existed between her and the English military. What's remarkable is how effective her campaign became, not just in disrupting shipments, but in planting fear. French merchants began avoiding certain coastal routes altogether. Naval commanders had to allocate more ships to escort duties, and yet even in the face of all this, no major French naval operation was ever launched to destroy Jeanne's fleet outright. Why? Possibly because of its mobility, possibly because it was relatively small and hard to track, and possibly because Jeanne herself wasn't viewed as a serious political threat in the long run. A rogue widow, however disruptive, was considered less dangerous than the many noble families jockeying for control of Brittany. But maybe they should have paid closer attention. Jeanne wasn't simply striking out randomly. She had specific targets. Her attacks fell heaviest on French forces around the western coasts, where her husband had once served loyally before being betrayed. The symbolism was hard to miss. She wasn't attacking France as a whole. She was attacking the parts of France responsible for Olivier de Clisson's execution. There are legends, of course, built around her legacy. Some say she personally wielded a sword during the executions. Others describe her forcing noble prisoners to kneel on deck before beheading them. Still others claim she sometimes left captured ships adrift, their crews bound and left to starve, a slow death in open water. But much of this comes from later embellishment. What we do know is this. Jeanne's attacks were precise, her victims carefully chosen, and her campaign long. She became known among the French nobility as the Lioness of Brittany. It was a title that echoed back into France's royal courts and whispered its way through the corridors of power. A noblewoman, once one of their own, had turned the sea into her courtroom, and she was issuing death sentences. But life at sea was not sustainable forever. Jeanne had children to raise. Her eldest son, Olivier, was growing into manhood during these years. What kind of lessons did he absorb while watching his mother issue vengeance beneath a blood-coloured sail? What stories did he tell about the father he barely remembered, the betrayal that launched their exile, the black ships they called home? Eventually Jeanne made her way back to dry land. Some say her ships were damaged and too costly to maintain. Others believe she simply tired of the war. She settled in the English-controlled parts of Brittany, remarried to a man named Sir Walter Bentley, a knight loyal to the English king, and faded from official record. Her later life was far more quiet than the decade that preceded it. No more ships, no more executions, just a return to the life she had once known, albeit under very different circumstances. But even as she retired from the sea, the French crown never brought her to justice. No trial, no bounty ever collected, no royal execution. For all the blood she had spilled, Jeanne de Clisson lived out her final years in peace, or at least in silence. It's a curious absence, one that speaks to something deeper. Perhaps the French crown did not want to admit that it had been humiliated so thoroughly by one of its own women. Perhaps they feared the political fallout of arresting her, that it might rekindle Breton resentment at a time when France needed unity. Or maybe, just maybe, they knew that punishing her would only make her more famous. So instead, Jeanne de Clisson was quietly erased, her acts unmentioned in most official chronicles, her name reduced to a whisper in local records. For a time, she disappeared almost entirely from written history, but the ocean remembers differently. The towns she raided, the ports she blocked, the nobles she hunted, they remembered. Her black ships became legend, then folklore, then myth, and that raises a question that history can't quite answer. How does a woman, once feared across the Channel and known to kings, vanish so thoroughly from the page? And what kind of legacy does she leave behind? A story of revenge, or a warning about the cost of silence? By the time Jeanne de Clisson stepped back onto dry land for the final time, the salt had weathered her skin, and her name had carved out a fearsome place in maritime memory. She had spent over a decade directing a campaign of vengeance from the deck of a black-sailed warship. She had hunted noblemen, she had executed courtiers, she had built her own justice where none was given. But that part of her life, as violent and disruptive as it was, ended in something few would have expected: quiet retirement. No records exist of Jeanne ever facing retribution for her piracy. She never stood trial. No fleet was ever commissioned to pursue her. No bounty seems to have been placed on her head, despite the fact that she had directly interfered with royal supply routes and executed nobles in defiance of the king. In a world where common pirates were often dragged through city streets and hanged at public docks, Jeanne walked away untouched. That fact has puzzled historians for centuries. How could a woman who had essentially declared her own war on the French crown simply be allowed to stop? There are a few possibilities. Some suggest that her political usefulness to the English had insulated her. By the time she was done sailing, England controlled large parts of Brittany, and Jeanne was likely under the protection of sympathetic commanders. Her third husband, Sir Walter Bentley, was a respected English knight who had fought in the 100 Years' War and had ties to English leadership in the region. He may have helped negotiate her protection, or at the very least, her erasure. Others believe that the French monarchy simply didn't want the scandal of a noblewoman turned pirate to linger in public memory. Pursuing her might bring her crimes back into the spotlight, and that meant also revisiting the suspicious and hasty execution of her husband Olivier de Clisson. Better perhaps to let the matter fade, and fade it did. Jeanne died around 1359, likely in her 50s. There are no grand tombs, no monuments by the sea, no public legacy in her homeland. Her story was passed on mostly through regional oral traditions and obscure genealogies. For centuries, her piracy was remembered not by royal courts but by coastal fishermen, dockworkers and small-town Breton families. Local legends told of the red sails of the Black Fleet, of nobles vanishing at sea, and of a woman who had turned grief into an empire of vengeance. Meanwhile, her son Olivier de Clisson, raised amidst that turmoil, took a different path. He went on to serve as a commander for the French crown, the very court that had killed his father. It seems contradictory at first. How could the son of a pirate raised in exile and schooled in revenge return to serve the very system his mother had fought against? But Olivier was not his mother. He had ambitions beyond the sea. In a strange twist of history, the man whose father had been executed as a traitor rose through the ranks of the French military and eventually became Constable of France, the highest military officer in the kingdom. By the end of his life, Olivier de Clisson was a powerful nobleman, trusted by kings, and deeply embedded in the very structure that had once destroyed his family. It is a curious legacy. Jeanne's campaign had been born of fury and injustice. She carved a path of destruction in defence of her husband's name, but it was her son who would ultimately restore that name by choosing diplomacy, court politics, and military service. Where she had painted her ships black and soaked the decks in blood, he wore armour etched with the French fleur-de-lis and commanded armies under royal banners. Both mother and son, in their own ways, sought redemption, one through fire, the other through assimilation. But Jeanne's story raises other questions, ones that don't fit neatly into official chronicles or family trees. What did she feel in her final years, watching her son walk the halls of the court that had once? You'd be forgiven for thinking that Anne Bonny's story began at sea, but it didn't. Before the black powder smoke and the stolen ships, before the trial and the sentence and the strange twist of fate that followed, there was scandal. The kind of scandal colonial towns whispered about behind shuttered windows. She was born sometime around 1700, possibly in County Cork, Ireland. Her father, William Cormac, was a lawyer, successful, clever, and unfortunately married. Her mother, Mary Brennan, was a maid in the household. That detail alone created trouble. William's affair was discovered, and rather than face disgrace, he fled Ireland with his new lover and their illegitimate daughter. The family landed in the Carolina colony, a place still raw, half-built, and far from the judgmental eyes of Dublin society. William tried to reinvent himself in Charleston. He became a merchant, bought land, dressed Anne as a boy for a time to pass her off as a different child. But secrets have a way of surfacing. The community eventually learned the truth about Anne's origins. Despite the whispers, William managed to build a stable, profitable life. Anne grew up not as a poor commoner, but with relative comfort. She was headstrong, intelligent, and quick to anger. One story, possibly exaggerated, claims that she once stabbed a serving girl with a dinner knife over a petty argument. But life in Charleston bored her society bored her. The expectations of polite womanhood, embroidery, church, marriage to a suitable man felt like shackles. She wanted something else. And so, when James Bonney entered the picture, she saw a way out. James was a pirate-turned-informant. He had served under the infamous Charles Vane, but later began working for the British Crown, reporting on smugglers and freebooters. He was not particularly brave or wealthy, but he offered Anne a chance to rebel. They eloped around 1718, much to her father's fury. William disowned her, cutting off her inheritance. Anne and James moved to Nassau in the Bahamas, a place that would become the centre of her transformation. At the time, Nassau was less a town and more a chaotic pirate republic. The island was teeming with rogue sailors, corrupt officials, and every manner of outcast. Blackbeard had once held court there. Calico Jack Rackham, whose name would later be tied to Anne's own, roamed its ports. The British Crown had declared a general pardon for pirates, and many captains had accepted it. But lawlessness still reigned. Anne hated the new life James offered. He spent his days trying to curry favour with British officials, acting as a spy for Governor Woodes Rogers. Anne, on the other hand, immersed herself in the wilder corners of Nassau, taverns, docks, gambling dens. There she met Jack Rackham. He was clever, ambitious, and still committed to the pirate's life. He had little patience for the pardon or the Crown's false promises. He saw Anne, red-haired, fierce, and plainly uninterested in social convention, as an equal. They began an affair almost immediately. When James found out, he tried to have her whipped under colonial law. Anne refused to be punished like a disobedient wife. Instead, she chose piracy. She ran away with Jack and joined his crew. This was not unheard of. Women aboard pirate ships. IPS weren't common, but they weren't unheard of either. Anne disguised herself as a man when necessary, but soon the crew accepted her as she was. She dressed as she liked, fought with pistols and cutlass, and took part in raids and plundering along the Caribbean. Witnesses described her as wanton and fierce, a woman who swore, drank, and fought as hard as any man on board. At some point, another woman joined the crew, Mary Read, also disguised as a man. The two became close friends, possibly lovers. Together with Jack, they formed a strange trio, a captain and two women who defied every rule of society and law. But such freedom could never last. By 1720, Governor Rogers had lost patience with Rackham's return to piracy. He sent a privateer ship after them. One night, while Rackham's crew was anchored off the coast of Jamaica, celebrating a recent prize, the privateer attacked. Most of the crew, drunk and unprepared, surrendered. Only Anne and Mary, according to reports, resisted. They stood on deck, firing pistols, shouting curses, urging the others to fight. When it became clear no help was coming, they were overpowered and arrested. In November of that year, they were tried in a colonial courtroom in Spanish Town, Jamaica. The trial transcripts still survive, dry and bureaucratic, but hiding under them is the chaos of lives that had burned bright and fast. Anne Bonney stood before the court. 20 years old, a pirate, a married woman who had run away, taken lovers and spilled blood on the high seas. The court didn't know what to do with her. They condemned her to hang. But Anne wasn't finished yet. As the sentence was handed down, both she and Mary Read claimed to be pregnant. Under colonial law, it was illegal to execute a woman carrying a child. The court reluctantly granted a temporary stay. It was known as pleading the belly. Mary would die in prison not long after, likely of fever or childbirth complications. Jack Rackham was hanged and left to rot in a public cage, but Anne Bonney disappeared from history. There are no further records of her execution, no death certificate, no grave, no prison logs, no shipping manifest carrying her back to England. She simply vanished. And that absence leaves behind a question that still lingers like smoke from a gun deck. What happened to Anne Bonney after the trial? Betrayed them? Did she see it as justice or betrayal? Did she regret her war, or consider it a necessary chapter before peace? There is no surviving letter, no diary, just a long silence after her name disappears from records. And yet, in the centuries that followed, her image began to re-emerge, romanticised, of course, turned into pirate fiction, feminist folklore, historical drama. In some versions, she's depicted as a bloodthirsty she-wolf, in others, as a tragic heroine, but neither quite captures the slow, quiet horror that defined her story, that a loyal family could be erased by royal politics, and that a woman had to become an outlaw simply to be heard. What makes Jeanne de Clisson's life so strangely modern is not the piracy, but the way history treated her afterward. She was dangerous, yes, but she was also inconvenient, and inconvenient women often disappear from the page not because they were unimportant, but because they were too sharp to fit inside the edges of history's script. In today's museums, she is rarely mentioned. There are few plaques, no famous biographies taught in school. You'll find Anne Bonny and Mary Read, the better-known female pirates, splashed across children's books and documentaries, but Jeanne, she exists mostly in the footnotes. Yet her impact, however quietly buried, remains. She proved something medieval Europe wasn't quite ready to accept, that women, when denied justice, could seize it for themselves, even if it meant becoming the very monster the system feared most. And in the end, we are left with this quiet, unfinished thought. What would have happened if Jeanne de Clisson had been given a trial instead of a reason for revenge? Would history have remembered her at all? When Anne Bonny pleaded her belly in the court at Spanish Town in 1720, she likely expected, or at least hoped, that she would buy time. Time was precious for condemned pirates. It might mean escape, mercy, or the quiet fading of interest from colonial officials. In Anne's case, that time turned into something else entirely. Mystery. The court accepted her claim of pregnancy, as they were legally required to do. Both she and Mary Read were moved to a colonial jail to await either the birth of their children or further judgment. For Mary, the outcome was grim and short-lived. Records show she died in prison in 1721, likely of complications from childbirth or disease, which was rampant in those poorly ventilated cells. Her body was interred at St. Catherine's Parish in Jamaica, a burial site noted in the ledger, though her grave, like her story, has long since vanished. Anne Bonny, on the other hand, slipped quietly off the page. There is no execution record, no release documents, no death certificate. For a woman condemned to death by hanging and then granted a stay due to pregnancy, this absence is peculiar. The British courts were methodical, even in the colonies. They recorded hangings, especially when the condemned were as high profile as Anne Bonny, whose notoriety had spread through Caribbean waters. So where did she go? Some historians believe that Anne Bonny was quietly ransomed or bailed out by her father, William Cormac. He was still a man of means and influence in South Carolina. It's entirely plausible that he negotiated, or paid, for her release, under the condition that she disappear from public life. In the colonies, justice was uneven and porous, and influence often counted for more than law. A few bribes to colonial officials, a promise to keep her out of trouble, and Anne could have been released under the radar. There's even a whisper of evidence. Hence in South Carolina, genealogical records suggest that an Anne Bonny may have married a man named Joseph Burleigh sometime in the mid-1720s. They appear to have had several children and lived quiet, unremarkable lives. It's not a certainty. The name Anne Bonny was not unique, but it's suggestive. Other local legends claim she returned to Charleston, lived under an assumed name, and told no one of her past. If true, this would make her one of the few pirates to survive not just capture, but public trial and death sentence. But this fate, fading into obscurity, anonymous domestic life, wasn't unique to Anne. In fact, this was often the hidden fate of female pirates who were caught. Public executions of women were, by the early 18th century, deeply frowned upon by many in British society. Women were considered symbols of moral order, domestic virtue, and divine obedience. To hang them like men, especially for crimes that involved violence, sex, or mutiny, threatened to disturb the social fabric. In the case of Anne and Mary, their visibility as pirates made them rare exceptions, but in most cases female pirates were tried quietly and, when possible, punished in less dramatic ways. Some were imprisoned indefinitely, not hanged but forgotten. Others were shipped back to England, where they vanished into poorhouses, workhouses, or distant towns. A few received royal pardons or were released on the condition they leave piracy behind. The pirate Anne Dieuleveux, for example, another female pirate from the Caribbean, fought alongside her husband and later commanded a ship of her own. She was eventually captured by Spanish forces but released, possibly because she was a woman and a mother. The Spanish had little desire to try a woman for piracy. It drew unwanted attention, and there was no clear legal path forward. She faded from history not because she was unimpotent, but because she was too complicated to process. This repeated pattern shows us something about the limitations of early modern justice. The system had plenty of tools for dealing with men who disobeyed: execution, imprisonment, branding. But women who defied the system, especially publicly and violently, created a paradox. They were dangerous, yes, but they also defied the image society had built for them. To hang them was to acknowledge that women could rebel, that they could kill, that they could seize ships, drink rum, and command fear. And so, more often than not, these women were erased, not killed, not celebrated, just removed from sight. Anne Bonny, if she survived the jail cell, likely knew she had no place left in the world of piracy. By 1725, the age of the Golden Pirates was already dying. Blackbeard was dead. Charles Vane had been hanged. Calico Jack, her lover, was a skeleton swinging in a gibbet. The British Navy had grown stronger, more organised, and far less tolerant of rebellion. Nassau had become a naval stronghold, not a pirate's paradise. So what does a former pirate do when there are no ships left to steal? She hides, she raises children, she tells no stories. Perhaps Anne Bonny grew old in Charleston watching merchant ships sail past the harbour she once prowled. Maybe she told bedtime stories that sounded a little too real. Maybe she kept her pistols in a box under the floorboards. Or maybe she said nothing at all. By 1730 she would have been around 30 years old. By then the last vestiges of pirate culture had withered, and colonial authorities had rewritten the narrative. Pirates were criminals, traitors, demons of the sea, not rebellious women or wronged sailors. Anne Bonny's story, had it been told aloud, would have been met not with admiration but silence or shame. This slow removal from memory was not an accident, it was a form of control. For every recorded execution of a female pirate, there are dozens of cases where the woman simply disappears from the records. Trials cut short, executions delayed, lives commuted into domestic silence. It's as if the world preferred not to remember that women too could raise a black flag. Which brings us back to the same question. The one colonial records never quite answered. Did Anne Bonny live? And if so, did she ever speak again of the sea? Anne Bonny's vanishing act left behind more than just unanswered questions. It left a space, an open, silent place in the historical record, into which speculation, myth and misunderstanding have steadily crept. And what happens in history when the facts fade? People begin to invent, not all at once and not always with malice, but over time. Legends begin to fill in the blanks that bureaucrats and judges left behind. And Anne Bonny, who once stood shouting on a deck with a pistol in her hand, was slowly recast into all kinds of roles depending on who told the story. To some, she became a folk hero. In later centuries, when Romanticism touched even the most bloodied histories, writers imagined Anne as a kind of Caribbean Joan of Arc. Courageous, misunderstood, betrayed by love but redeemed by freedom. In cheap pulp novels, she became the red-haired fury who spat in the face of kings, led mutinies and laughed while storming merchant ships. She was paired with Mary Read in many of these tales, and their friendship, whether romantic or not, was often stretched into something theatrical, dramatic, or tragically heroic. But there is no record of Anne Bonny writing letters, keeping journals, or speaking publicly after her trial. And so every version of her after that moment, every quiet retirement or wild escape, is a shadow of what might have been. Even official documents start to blur after 1721. A few reports from the Carolinas mention a woman who may have been Bonny, now married and living modestly. One death record, dated 1782, lists an Anne Bonny who died at 80 years old in South Carolina. It's possible. If she had lived a quiet life after her release, this would be the right timeline. But even that is uncertain. Colonial records were messy, names reused, handwriting misread, and in that uncertainty the real Anne Bonny slips further from reach. This fate of being half remembered, half invented, was not unique to Anne. Many women in history who dared to step outside of the roles designed for them ended up in this strange in-between place. Too dangerous to glorify, too fascinating to ignore. Some, like her, were erased by officialdom and revived by fiction centuries later. And that process, slow, uneven and oddly comforting, has turned Anne Bonny into something larger than she ever was, a symbol of refusal. But it's worth remembering the boring version of her too. The Anne who grew up in Charleston, probably learning French and embroidery. The Anne who watched merchant ships from the harbour before she ever stepped aboard one. The Anne who possibly gave birth in a damp prison cell, not knowing whether she would live or hang. The Anne who may have carried the scars of battle long after the battles were over. There is power in those mundane details, the ones too small for grand storytelling but too human to forget. Piracy was not a grand adventure. It was hunger, illness, betrayal. It was constant negotiation between crews, captains, and corrupt governors. Female pirates especially lived under the constant threat of not just death, but erasure. They had to navigate not only gunfire, but expectations of what a woman should be, how she should behave, and what the world would tolerate. Anne Bonny did not tolerate much. Even in her final known words, spoken to Jack Rackham before his hanging, there was a note of cold finality. According to legend, when allowed to visit him one last time in prison, she looked through the bars and said, "Had you fought like a man, you needn't be hanged like a dog." Then she turned and walked away. That sentence, like so much of her story, may have been embellished, but it rings with a kind of tired truth. Not theatrical, not fiery, just tired. By then she'd seen what defiance cost. She'd seen what happened to pirates when the sea was taken from them. And that might be the quietest tragedy of Anne Bonny's story. Not the trial, not the execution that never came, but the silence that followed, the slow fade into history's shadows, the ordinary life lived in whispers by a woman who once refused to be ordinary. When we remember Anne Bonny today, we often picture her with pistols drawn, coat flaring in the sea wind, daring the world to come after her. But perhaps a more fitting image is one that history never recorded. A woman, older now, watching her children play near a coastal inlet, her eyes always on the horizon, waiting, listening, and remembering a time when her name made governors flinch. Not because she was loud, but because she refused to vanish, even when the world tried to forget her. And so we ask, one last time, if Anne Bonny lived a quiet life after the trial, did she miss the sea? When we imagine the world of pirates, we often picture ship decks, treasure maps, and men shouting across the sea. Maybe a few fierce female captains too, like Anne Bonny or Mary Read. But we rarely pause to think about the women who didn't sail, the ones who lived on shore in the shadows of pirate towns like Nassau, Port Royal, or Tortuga. These women weren't brandishing cutlasses or boarding merchant ships, yet their lives were tightly woven into piracy's golden age. And just like the pirates they supported, they faced danger, judgment, and sometimes quiet ruin. In the early 18th century, pirate settlements weren't neat or orderly towns. They were loud, crowded ports where stolen goods changed hands as fast as rum flowed. The towns were often filled with people who didn't quite belong anywhere else. Escaped servants, soldiers turned smugglers, failed planters, runaway slaves, and women looking to survive in a world that offered them few choices. Many of these women worked as traders, tavern keepers, laundresses, or companions. They weren't pirates by profession, but they played essential roles in the pirate economy. Some were wives or lovers of well-known captains. Others ran inns that quietly exchanged information, stored stolen goods, or passed bribes to local officials. And while history tends to remember the men who stood on trial, the women behind the scenes usually disappeared without a trace. But occasionally, the records give us a glimpse. In the pirate haven of Nassau, for example, there were women who operated informal markets near the docks. These weren't official merchants with licenses. They were women who sold vegetables, fish, soap, and second-hand clothes, often in exchange for pirate silver. Some even bartered directly with stolen goods. A piece of Spanish lace from a looted galleon might end up on the arm of a local midwife. A silver spoon from a merchant ship might be traded for food. These small exchanges kept the local economy alive and tied these women, quietly but deeply, to piracy. There are court records showing that when pirates were captured, colonial officials sometimes asked questions about the women they consorted with on land. Authorities wanted to know who had received stolen goods, who had offered shelter, who had warned pirates of impending raids. In some cases, women were charged with aiding and abetting piracy, but the language was vague, the evidence thin, proving that someone knew stolen items came from piracy was difficult when the entire town relied on them. Still, some were arrested. In Jamaica, a woman named Grace Thomas was accused in 1718 of harbouring pirates in her home and laundering their loot. She claimed she ran a laundry service and didn't ask questions about the clothes or coins she handled. No conviction was recorded. Her name vanished after that. In Port Royal, before it was famously destroyed by the earthquake of 1692, tavern women were known for their connections to the sea's more violent men. These women served drinks, took bets, and occasionally offered company for the night. But they were also, unofficially, information brokers. If a pirate captain needed to know whether a ship was in port, or if the governor's guards had tightened, he might ask one of these women. They heard everything, especially from drunk sailors, and in return they earned protection, and sometimes danger. The legal system of the time didn't know exactly what to do with such women. They weren't sailors, so they couldn't be tried as pirates under the usual laws, but they weren't considered entirely innocent either. When caught in the dragnet of pirate suppression, they were usually fined, jailed briefly, or banished. The courts avoided spectacle. The hanging of women for merely associating with pirates was bad for colonial order. Instead, these women were quietly pushed out, forgotten, unwritten. But that doesn't mean their lives were uneventful. For many, association with pirates brought temporary wealth, fine clothes, better housing, silver jewellery. But it also brought instability. Pirate wealth was fleeting. A lover might leave port and never return. A protector might be captured, hanged, or killed in a brawl. And when that happened, the woman left behind would often find herself suddenly vulnerable, accused of collusion, or simply evicted from her home. Some women leaned into the chaos. They ran inns that doubled as trading posts. They held multiple relationships, hedging their bets. Some even acted as informal bankers, holding on to pirates' earnings between voyages. These women were smart, shrewd, and often invisible to the history books. They operated on the edge of respectability, knowing that society wouldn't protect them, but also knowing that silence and discretion could offer a kind of power. And for many of these women, the end came not with drama, but with slow decline. When the British cracked down on piracy in the 1720s, places like Nassau were slowly transformed from pirate enclaves to naval outposts. The women who had once traded with pirates found themselves out of customers. The inns became quieter. The coin stopped flowing. British soldiers replaced pirate crews, and with them came rules, taxes, and scrutiny. The market women moved inland. The tavern keepers closed. The informants went quiet. Some may have married. Others faded into poverty. A few might have moved to new colonies, looking for the next unregulated port. Their names were rarely recorded, their stories almost never told, and yet, without them, piracy could not have survived for as long as it did. So next time someone asks what a pirate town looked like, picture this. Not just flags and flintlocks, but baskets of vegetables on docks. A woman scrubbing blood from a shirt she didn't ask questions about. A whispered warning passed in a smoky room. A ledger hidden beneath a floorboard. The quiet work of survival, done by those who never set foot on a ship, but who shaped the course of piracy all the same. But as these towns emptied and the last pirate ships vanished from sight, one question lingered. What happened to the women when the sea no longer needed them? When we imagine the world of pirates, we often picture ship decks, treasure maps, and men shouting across the sea. Maybe a few fierce female captains too, like Anne Bonny or Mary Red, but we rarely pause to think about the women who didn't sail, the ones who lived on shore, in the shadows of pirate towns like Nassau, Port Royal, or Tortuga. These women weren't brandishing cutlasses or boarding merchant ships, yet their lives were tightly woven into piracy's golden age, and just like the pirates they supported, they faced dans, judgment, and sometimes quiet ruin. In the early 18th century, pirate settlements weren't neat or orderly towns. They were loud, crowded ports where stolen goods changed hands as fast as rum flowed. The towns were often filled with people who didn't quite belong anywhere else. Escaped servants, soldiers turned smugglers, failed planters, runaway slaves, and women looking to survive in a world that offered them few choices. Many of these women worked as traders, tavern keepers, laundresses, or companions. They weren't pirates by profession, but they played essential roles in the pirate economy. Some were wives or lovers of well-known captains. Others ran inns that quietly exchanged information, stored stolen goods, or passed bribes to local officials. And while history tends to remember the men who stood on trial, the women behind the scenes usually disappeared without a trace. But occasionally, the records give us a glimpse. In the pirate haven of Nassau, for example, there were women who operated informal markets near the docks. These weren't official merchants with licenses. They were women who sold vegetables, fish, soap, and second-hand clothes, often in exchange for pirate silver. Some even bartered directly with stolen goods. A piece of Spanish lace from a looted galleon might end up on the arm of a local midwife. A silver spoon from a merchant ship might be traded for food. These small exchanges kept the local economy alive and tied these women quietly but deeply to piracy. There are court records showing that when pirates were captured, colonial officials sometimes asked questions about the women they consorted with on land. Authorities wanted to know who had received stolen goods, who had offered shelter, who had warned pirates of impending raids. In some cases, women were charged with aiding and abetting piracy, but the language was vague. The Evi, dense, thin, proving that someone knew stolen items came from piracy was difficult when the entire town relied on them. Still, some were arrested. In Jamaica, a woman named Grace Thomas was accused in 1718 of harbouring pirates in her home and laundering their loot. She claimed she ran a laundry service and didn't ask questions about the clothes or coins she handled. No conviction was recorded. Her name vanished after that. In Port Royal, before it was famously destroyed by the earthquake of 1692, tavern women were known for their connections to the sea's more violent men. These women served drinks, took bets, and occasionally offered company for the night, but they were also unofficially information brokers. If a pirate captain needed to know whether a ship was in port or if the governor's guards had tightened, he might ask one of these women. They heard everything, especially from drunk sailors, and in return they earned protection, and sometimes danger. The legal system of the time didn't know exactly what to do with such women. They weren't sailors, so they couldn't be tried as pirates under the usual laws, but they weren't considered entirely innocent either. When caught in the dragnet of pirate suppression, they were usually fined, jailed briefly, or banished. The courts avoided spectacle. The hanging of women for merely associating with pirates was bad for colonial order. Instead, these women were quietly pushed out, forgotten, unwritten. But that doesn't mean their lives were uneventful. For many, association with pirates brought temporary wealth, fine clothes, better housing, silver jewellery, but it also brought instability. Pirate wealth was fleeting. A lover might leave port and never return. A protector might be captured, hanged, or killed in a brawl. And when that happened, the woman left behind would often find herself suddenly vulnerable, accused of collusion, or simply evicted from her home. Some women leaned into the chaos. They ran inns that doubled as trading posts. They held multiple relationships, hedging their bets. Some even acted as informal bankers, holding on to pirates' earnings between voyages. These women were smart, shrewd, and often invisible to the history books. They operated on the edge of respectability, knowing that society wouldn't protect them, but also knowing that silence and discretion could offer a kind of power. And for many of these women, the end came not with drama, but with slow decline. When the British cracked down on piracy in the 1720s, places like Nassau were slowly transformed from pirate enclaves to naval outposts. The women who had once traded with pirates found themselves out of customers. The inns became quieter, the coin stopped flowing. British soldiers replaced pirate crews, and with them came rules, taxes, and scrutiny. The market women moved inland, the tavern keepers closed, the informants went quiet. Some may have married, others faded into poverty. A few might have moved to new colonies looking for the next unregulated port. Their names were rarely recorded, their stories almost never told. And yet, without them, piracy could not have survived for as long as it did. So next time someone asks what a pirate town looked like, picture this. Not just flags and flintlocks, but baskets of vegetables on docks, a woman scrubbing blood from a shirt she didn't ask questions about, a whispered warning passed in a smoky room, a ledger hidden beneath a floorboard, the quiet work of survival done by those who never set foot on a ship, but who shaped the course of piracy all the same. But as these towns emptied, and the last pirate ships vanished from sight, one question lingered. What happened to the women when the sea no longer needed them? By the mid-1720s, the golden age of piracy was coming to an end. The British Crown had made up its mind. Piracy was no longer tolerable. With each new naval campaign and each public hanging, the pirate world shrank a little more. Towns that had once thrived on stolen Spanish silver began to feel the silence. And in this slow collapse, it wasn't just the captains and crews who vanished. It was also the women who had built entire lives on the outskirts of this strange, floating world. In Nassau, the Royal Navy arrived not with cannon fire, but with paperwork and naval codes. The British governor, Woodes Rogers, made his entrance into the town in 1718 with promises of pardon for pirates who surrendered. Many did, some didn't, but either way, the culture shifted. The wildness that had defined Nassau's streets, men yelling in 6 different languages, women selling rum from front doors, deals made with knives on tavern floors, began to disappear. For the women who had once kept pirate society running from behind the scenes, the transition was difficult. Many had relied on the constant coming and going of crews. They had their rhythms, when ships landed, when coin flowed, when the best time was to ask for payment, or to quietly leave town. But now ships still came, only they were flying the Union Jack and filled with men who answered to a payroll, not a captain's mood. These were naval officers and administrators, not gamblers or drunks. The economy of risk that had once rewarded pirate-friendly women was crumbling. In the old days, a tavern woman could make a living in information. She might hear that a Spanish treasure fleet was heading toward Havana. She could sell that rumour to a pirate for a few coins or use it to trade for protection. But now, with pirates gone, the information was worth little, and the risk of speaking too freely, especially under a new governor with ties to London, had grown too high. Some women adapted. They cleaned up their taverns, posted signs that declared loyalty to the crown, and served watered-down ale to officers with polished boots. A few even received official lihat. Senses, a curious twist considering their past dealings, but others couldn't make the shift. Their reputations, long built on connections to piracy, worked against them. The new officials kept lists. They whispered about women of ill fame, and many were quietly told to leave town. Others were simply never visited again. One woman named Catherine, sometimes called Cat of the Docks, was known to have housed at least 3 pirate crews during her years in Nassau. She kept a back room where men could hide out during royal patrols. Her tavern was once among the busiest in the town. By 1725 she was seen begging outside the governor's house. There's no record of where she went after that. Across the Caribbean, similar stories played out. In Tortuga, the French turned their attention to plantation development, and the old pirate haunts were slowly absorbed into sugar production. Women who had once traded favours or housed stolen goods now found themselves pressed into different roles, working for colonial families, or worse, being accused of crimes that had never been prosecuted before. A loose mouth that once passed for cleverness was now labelled dangerous. Old associations became liabilities. In Port Royal, the town never fully recovered after the devastating earthquake of 1692, but remnants of pirate life had persisted for decades. Women had held on to the business of taverns, laundries, and informal markets, but by the 1730s, the city had become more proper, or at least more controlled. The British built fortifications and deepened ties to commerce. The pirate years became a whispered memory. A few women tried to write petitions, claiming they had been useful to the crown by helping cleanse the town of disorder. Some were granted small favours, most were ignored. But what about the women who left before things got bad? There are scattered accounts of some women moving inland, starting anew. In Jamaica's rural parishes, baptismal records show sudden appearances of older women listed simply as widows, sometimes without mention of a husband's name. One theory is that these were former pirate associates who had reinvented themselves under new identities. They married local men, took up farming, and never spoke of their past. It was a kind of survival, erasing oneself to begin again. Others weren't so lucky. In some colonies, suspicion followed any woman who had been too familiar with pirates. Even decades after the hangings ended, such women were refused property rights, barred from church sacraments, or excluded from respectable company. Their punishment wasn't execution, it was invisibility. Yet despite all this, traces of their presence remain in the dullest of places: shipping logs, tax rolls, court documents, and marriage certificates. In Antigua, a woman named Eliza Grant was fined for accepting uncertain coin in her shop, likely pirate silver. In Barbados, a woman named Monsieur Dumas was noted as having a house often visited by undesirables, language that typically meant former privateers. They weren't wanted, but they weren't erased either. Even in London, whispers about Caribbean women who had seen too much occasionally made it into letters and pamphlets. The city was filled with colonial returnees. Soldiers, governors, missionaries, and many brought back stories of strange women in the tropics. Most were reduced to stereotypes. Some were remembered as witches, others as temptresses. But hidden inside those accounts were fragments of real lives. Women who had lived through piracy, not as captains or outlaws, but as traders, hostesses, and survivors. And as the age of empire replaced the age of piracy, one question quietly persisted among colonial officials. Could these women ever truly be trusted again?